Section 12 of the Piazza Tales by Herman Melville. This recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 5D, The Encantadas, Sketch Fourth, A Pisgah View from the Rock. That done, he leads him to the highest mount, from whence far off he unto him did show. If you seek to ascend Rock Rodondo, take the following prescription. Go 3 voyages round the world as a main royal man of the tallest frigate that floats, then serve a year or 2 apprenticeship to the guides who conduct strangers up the peak of Teneriffe, and as many more respectively to a rope dancer, an Indian juggler, and a chamois. This done, come and be rewarded by the view from our tower. How we get there we alone know. If we sought to tell others, what the wiser were they? Suffice it that here at the summit you and I stand. Does any balloonist, does the outlooking man in the moon, take a broader view of space? Much thus, one fancies, looks the universe from Milton's celestial battlements. A boundless watery Kentucky, here Daniel Boone would have dwelt content. Never heed for the present yonder burnt district of the Enchanted Isles. Look edgewise, as it were, past them to the south. You see nothing, but permit me to point out the direction, if not the place, of certain interesting objects in the vast sea, which, kissing this tower's base, we behold unscrolling itself towards the Antarctic Pole. We stand now 10 miles from the equator. Yonder, to the east, some 600 miles, lies the continent, this rock being just about on the parallel of Quito. Observe another thing here. We are at one of 3 uninhabited clusters, which, at pretty nearly uniform distances from the main sentinel, at long intervals from each other, the entire coast of South America. In a peculiar manner, also, they terminate the South American character of the country. Of the unnumbered Polynesian chains to the westward, not one partakes of the qualities of the Encantadas or Galapagos, the Isles of St. Felix and St. Ambrose, the Isles of Juan Fernandez and Mazafuero. Of the first it need not here to speak. The second lie a little above the southern tropic, lofty, inhospitable, and uninhabitable rocks, one of which, presenting 2 round hummocks connected by a low reef, exactly resembles a huge double-headed shot. The last lie in the latitude of 33 degrees, high, wild, and cloven. Juan Fernandez is sufficiently famous without further description. Mazafuero is a Spanish name, expressive of the fact that the isle so called lies more without, that is, further off the main, than its neighbor Juan. This isle, Mazafuero, has a very imposing aspect at a distance of 8 or 10 miles. Approached in one direction in cloudy weather, its great overhanging height and rugged contour, and more especially a peculiar slope of its broad summits, give it much the air of a vast iceberg drifting in tremendous poise. Its sides are split with dark cavernous recesses, as an old cathedral with its gloomy lateral chapels. Drawing nigh one of these gorges from sea, after a long voyage, and beholding some tatterdemalion outlaw, staff in hand, descending its steep rocks toward you, conveys a very queer emotion to a lover of the picturesque. On fishing parties from ships at various times I have chanced to visit each of these groups. The impression they give to the stranger pulling close up in his boat under their grim cliffs is that surely he must be their first discoverer, such for the most part is the unimpaired silence and solitude. And here, by the way, the mode in which these isles were really first lighted upon by Europeans is not unworthy of mention, especially as what is about to be said likewise applies to the original discovery of our Encantadas. Prior to the year 1563 The voyages made by Spanish ships from Peru to Chile were full of difficulty. Along this coast the winds from the south most generally prevail, and it had been an invariable custom to keep close in with the land, from a superstitious conceit on the part of the Spaniards that were they to lose sight of it, the eternal trade wind would waft them into unending waters from whence would be no return. Here, involved among tortuous capes and headlands, shoals and reefs, beating, too, against a continual head wind, often light, and sometimes for days and weeks sunk into utter calm, the provincial vessels, in many cases, suffered the extremest hardships in passages which at the present day seem to have been incredibly protracted. There is on record in some collections of nautical disasters an account of one of these ships, which, starting on a voyage whose duration was estimated at 10 days, spent 4 months at sea, and indeed never again entered harbor, for in the end she was cast away. Singular to tell, this craft never encountered a gale, but was the vexed sport of malicious calms and currents. Thrice out of provisions, she put back to an intermediate port and started afresh, but only yet again to return. Frequent fogs enveloped her, so that no observation could be had of her place, and once, when all hands were joyously anticipating sight of their destination, lo, the vapors lifted and disclosed the mountains from which they had taken their first departure. In the like deceptive vapors she had last struck upon a reef, whence ensued a long series of calamities too sad to detail. It was the famous pilot Juan Fernandez, immortalized by the island named after him, who put an end to these coasting tribulations by boldly venturing the experiment, as da Gama did before him with respect to Europe, of standing broad out from land. Here he found the winds favorable for getting to the south, and by running westward till beyond the influences of the trades, he regained the coast without difficulty, making the passage which, though in a high degree circuitous, proved far more expeditious than the normally direct one. Now it was upon these new tracks, and about the year 1670 or thereabouts, that the Enchanted Isles and the rest of the Sentinel groups, as they may be called, were discovered. Though I know of no account as to whether any of them were found inhabited or no, it may be reasonably concluded that they have been immemorial solitudes. But let us return to Redondo. Southwest from our tower lies all Polynesia, hundreds of leagues away, but straight west, on the precise line of his parallel, no land rises till your keel is beached upon the King's Mills, a nice little sail of, say, 5,000 miles. Having thus, by such distant references, with Redondo the only possible ones, settled our relative place on the sea, let us consider objects not quite so remote. Behold the grim and charred Enchanted Isles. This nearest crater-shaped headland is part of Albemarle, the largest of the group, being some 60 miles or more long and 15 broad. Did you ever lay eye on the real, genuine equator? Have you ever, in the largest sense, towed the line? Well, that identical crater-shaped headland there, all yellow lava, is cut by the equator exactly as a knife cuts straight through the center of a pumpkin pie. If you could only see so far, just to one side of that same headland, across yon low, dikey ground, you would catch sight of the Isle of Narborough, the loftiest land of the cluster, no soil whatever, one seamed clinker from top to bottom, abounding in black caves like smithies, its metallic shore ringing underfoot like plates of iron, its central volcanoes standing grouped like a gigantic chimney stack. Narborough and Albemarle are neighbors after a quite curious fashion. A familiar diagram will illustrate this strange neighborhood. Cut a channel at the above letter joint, and The middle transverse limb is Narborough, and all the rest is Albemarle. Volcanic Narborough lies in the black jaws of Albemarle like a wolf's red tongue in his open mouth. If now you desire the population of Albemarle, I will give you, in round numbers, the statistics, according to the most reliable estimates made upon the spot. Men, none. Anteaters, unknown. Man-haters, unknown. Lizards, 500,000. Snakes, 500,000. Spiders, 10,000,000. Salamanders, unknown. Devils, ditto, making a clean total of 11,000,000, exclusive of an incomputable host of fiends, anteaters, man-haters, and salamanders. Albemarle opens his mouth towards the setting sun. His distended jaws form a great bay, which Narborough, his tongue, divides into halves, one whereof is called Weather Bay, the other Lee Bay, while the volcanic promontories terminating his coasts are styled South Head and North Head. I note this because these bays are famous in the annals of the sperm whale fishery. The whales come here at certain seasons to calve. When ships first cruised hereabouts, I am told they used to blockade the entrance of Lee Bay when their boats going round by Weather Bay passed through Narborough Channel, and so had the leviathans very neatly in a pen. The day after we took fish at the base of this round tower we had a fine wind, and shooting round the north headland suddenly descried a fleet of full 30 sail, all beating to windward like a squadron in line. A brave sight as ever man saw, a most harmonious concord of rushing keels. Their 30 kelsons hummed like 30 harp strings, and looked as straight whilst they left their parallel traces on the sea. But there proved too many hunters for the game. The fleet broke up and went their separate ways out of sight, leaving my own ship and 2 trim gentlemen of London. These last, finding no luck either, likewise vanished, and Lee Bay, with all its appurtenances, and without a rival, devolved to us. The way of cruising here is this: you keep hovering about the entrance of the bay, in one beat and out the next, but at times, not always, as in other parts of the group, a racehorse of a current sweeps right across its mouth. So, with all sails set, you carefully ply your tacks. How often, standing at the foremast head at sunrise, with our patient prow pointed in between these isles, did I gaze upon that land, not of cakes, but of clinkers, not of streams of sparkling water, but arrested torrents of tormented lava. As the ship runs in from the open sea, Narborough presents its side in one dark craggy mass, soaring up some 5,000 or 6,000 feet, at which point it hoods itself in heavy clouds, whose lowest level fold is as clearly defined against the rocks as the snow line against the Andes. There is dire mischief going on in that upper dark. There toil the demons of fire, who, at intervals, irradiate the nights with a strange spectral illumination for miles and miles around, but unaccompanied by any further demonstration, or else suddenly announce themselves by terrific concussions and the full drama of a volcanic eruption. The blacker that cloud by day, the more may you look for light by night. Often whalemen have found themselves cruising nigh that burning mountain when all aglow with a ballroom blaze, or rather glassworks, you may call this same vitreous isle of Narborough with its tall chimney stacks. Where we still stand here on Rodondo we cannot see all the other isles, but it is a good place from which to point out where they lie. Yonder, though, to the east-northeast, I mark a distant dusky ridge. It is Abington Isle, one of the most northerly of the group, so solitary, remote, and blank it looks like no man's land seen off our northern shore. I doubt whether 2 human beings ever touched upon that spot. So far as yon Abington Isle is concerned, Adam and his billions of posterity remain uncreated. Ranging south of Abingdon, and quite out of sight behind the long spine of Albemarle, lies James Isle, so called by the early buccaneers after the luckless Stuart, Duke of York. Observe here, by the way, that excepting the isles particularized in comparatively recent times, and which mostly received the names of famous admirals, the Encantadas were first christened by the Spaniards. But these Spanish names were generally effaced on English charts by the subsequent christenings of the buccaneers, who in the middle of the 17th century called them after English noblemen and kings. Of these loyal freebooters and the things which associate their name with the Encantadas we shall hear anon. Nay, for only one little item immediately, for between James Isle and Albemarle lies a fantastic islet strangely known as Cowley's Enchanted Isle. But as all the group is deemed enchanted, the reason must be given for the spell within a spell involved by this particular designation. The name was bestowed by that excellent buccaneer himself on his first visit here. Speaking in his published voyages of this spot, he says, "My fancy led me to call it Cowley's Enchanted Isle, for we having had a sight of it upon several points of the compass, it appeared always in so many different forms, sometimes like a ruined fortification, upon another point like a great city," etc. No wonder, though, that among the Encantadas all sorts of ocular deceptions and mirages should be met. That Cowley linked his name with this self-transforming and bemocking isle suggests the possibility that it conveyed to him some meditative image of himself. At least, as is not impossible, if he were any relative of the mildly thoughtful and self-upbraiding poet Cowley, who lived about his time, the conceit might seem unwarranted, for that sort of thing evinced in the naming of this isle runs in the blood, and may be seen in pirates as in poets. Still, south of James Isle lie Jervis Isle, Duncan Isle, Grossman's Isle, Brattle Isle, Woods Isle, Chatham Isle, and various lesser isles, for the most part an archipelago of aridities, without inhabitant, history, or hope of either in all time to come. But not far from these are rather notable isles: Barrington, Charles's, Norfolk, and Hood's. Succeeding chapters will reveal some ground for their notability. End of Section 12. Sketch 4th. A Pisgah view from the rock. Section 13 of the Piazza Tales by Herman Melville. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 5E. The Encantadas, Sketch 5th. The Frigate and the Flyaway. Looking far forth into the ocean wide, a goodly ship with banners bravely dight, and flag in her topgallant I espied, through the main sea making her merry flight. Ere quitting Rodondo, it must not be omitted that here, in 1813, the U.S. frigate Essex, Captain David Porter, came near leaving her bones. Lying becalmed one morning with a strong current setting her rapidly toward the rocks, a strange sail was descried, which, not out of keeping with alleged enchantments of the neighborhood, seemed to be staggering under a violent wind, while the frigate lay lifeless, as if spellbound. But a light air springing up, all sail was made by the frigate in chase of the enemy, as supposed, he being deemed an English whale ship, but the rapidity of the current was so great that soon all sight was lost of him, and at meridian the Essex, spite of her drags, was driven so close under the foam-lashed cliffs of Rodondo that for a time all hands gave her up. A smart breeze, however, at last helped her off, though the escape was so critical as to seem almost miraculous. Thus saved from destruction herself, she now made use of that salvation to destroy the other vessel, if possible. Renewing the chase in the direction in which the stranger had disappeared, sight was caught of him the following morning. Upon being descried, he hoisted American colors and stood away from the Essex. A calm ensued, when, still confident that the stranger was an Englishman, Porter dispatched a cutter, not to board the enemy, but drive back his boats engaged in towing him. The cutter succeeded. Cutters were subsequently sent to capture him, the stranger now showing English colors in place of American. But when the frigate's boats were within a short distance of their hoped for prize, another sudden breeze sprang up, the stranger under all sail bore off to the westward, and ere night was hull down ahead of the Essex, which all this time lay perfectly becalmed. This enigmatic craft, American in the morning and English in the evening, her sails full of wind in a calm, was never again beheld. An enchanted ship, no doubt. So at least the sailors swore. This cruise of the Essex in the Pacific during the War of 1812 is perhaps the strangest and most stirring to be found in the history of the American Navy. She captured the furthest wandering vessels, visited the remotest seas and isles, long hovered in the charmed vicinity of the enchanted group, and finally valiantly gave up the ghost fighting two English frigates in the harbor of Valparaiso. Mention is made of her here for the same reason that the buccaneers will likewise receive record, because, like them, by long cruising among the isles, tortoise hunting upon their shores and generally exploring them, for these and other reasons the Essex is peculiarly associated with the Encantadas. Here be it said that you have but three eyewitness authorities worth mentioning touching the Enchanted Isles: Cowley the buccaneer, 1684; Colnett the whaling ground explorer, 1798; Porter the post captain, 1813. Other than these you have but barren, bootless allusions from some few passing voyagers or compilers. End of Sketch Fifth. The Frigate and Ship Flyaway. Section 14 of the Piazza Tales by Herman Melville. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 5F, The Encantadas, Sketch 6th, Barrington Isle and the Buccaneers. Let us all servile base subjection scorn, and as we be sons of the earth so wide, let us our fathers' heritage divide, and challenge to ourselves our portions due of all the patrimony which a few hold on hugger-mugger in their hand. Lords of the world, and so will wander free, whereso us listeth, uncontrolled of any. How bravely now we live, how jocund, how near the first inheritance, without fear, how free from little troubles. Near 2 centuries ago, Barrington Isle was the resort of that famous wing of the West Indian buccaneers which, upon their repulse from the Cuban waters, crossing the Isthmus of Darien, ravaged the Pacific side of the Spanish colonies, and, with the regularity and timing of a modern mail, waylaid the royal treasure ships plying between Manila and Acapulco. After the toils of piratic war, here they came to say their prayers, enjoy their free and easies, count their crackers from the cask, their doubloons from the keg, and measure their silks of Asia with long Toledos for their yardsticks. As a secure retreat, an undiscoverable hiding place, no spot in those days could have been better fitted. In the center of a vast and silent sea, but very little traversed, surrounded by islands whose inhospitable aspect might well drive away the chance navigator, and yet within a few days' sail of the opulent countries which they made their prey, the unmolested buccaneers found here that tranquillity which they fiercely denied to every civilized harbor in that part of the world. Here, after stress of weather, or a temporary drubbing at the hands of their vindictive foes, or in swift flight with golden booty, those old marauders came and lay snugly out of all harm's reach. But not only was the place a harbor of safety and a bower of ease, but for utility and other things it was most admirable. Barrington Isle is, in many respects, singularly adapted to careening, refitting, refreshing, and other seamen's purposes. Not only has it good water and good anchorage, well sheltered from all winds by the high land of Albemarle, but it is the least unproductive isle of the group. Tortoises good for food, trees good for fuel, and long grass good for bedding abound here, and there are pretty natural walks and several landscapes to be seen. Indeed, though in its locality belonging to the Enchanted group, Barrington Isle is so unlike most of its neighbors that it would hardly seem of kin to them. "I once landed on its western side," says a sentimental voyager long ago, "where it faces the black buttress of Albemarle. I walked beneath groves of trees, not very lofty, and not palm trees or orange trees or peach trees, to be sure, but for all that, after long seafaring, very beautiful to walk under, even though they supplied no fruit. And here, in calm spaces at the heads of glades, and on the shaded tops of slopes commanding the most quiet scenery, what do you think I saw? Seats which might have served Brahmins and presidents of peace societies, fine old ruins of what had once been symmetric lounges of stone and turf. They bore every mark both of artificialness and age, and were undoubtedly made by the buccaneers. One had been a long sofa with back and arms, just such a sofa as the poet Gray might have loved to throw himself upon, his Crebillon in hand. Though they sometimes tarried here for months at a time, and used the spot for a storing place for spare spars, sails, and casks, yet it is highly improbable that the buccaneers ever erected dwelling houses upon the isle. They never were here except their ships remained, and they would most likely have slept on board. I mention this because I cannot avoid the thought that it is hard to impute the construction of these romantic seats to any other motive than one of pure peacefulness and kindly fellowship with nature. That the buccaneers perpetrated the greatest outrages is very true. That some of them were mere cutthroats is not to be denied, but we know that here and there among their host was a Dampier, a Wafer, and a Cowley, and likewise other men whose worst reproach was their desperate fortunes, whom persecution or adversity, or secret and unavengable wrongs, had driven from Christian society to seek the melancholy solitude or the guilty adventures of the sea. At any rate, long as those ruins of seats on Barrington remain, the most singular monuments are furnished to the fact that all of the buccaneers were not unmitigated monsters. But during my ramble on the isle I was not long in discovering other tokens of things quite in accordance with those wild traits, popularly, and no doubt truly enough, imputed to the freebooters at large. Had I picked up old sails and rusty hoops, I would only have thought of the ship's carpenter and cooper. But I found old cutlasses and daggers reduced to mere threads of rust, which, doubtless, had stuck between Spanish ribs ere now. These were signs of the murderer and robber. The reveler likewise had left his trace. Mixed with shells, fragments of broken jars were lying here and there high up upon the beach. They were precisely like the jars now used upon the Spanish coast for the wine and pisco spirits of that country. With a rusty dagger fragment in one hand and a bit of wine jar in another, I sat me down on the ruinous green sofa I have spoken of, and bethought me long and deeply of these same Buccaneers. Could it be possible that they robbed and murdered one day, reveled the next, and rested themselves by turning meditative philosophers, rural poets, and seat builders on the third? Not very improbable, after all. For consider the vacillations of a man. Still, strange as it may seem, I must also abide by the more charitable thought, namely, that among these adventurers were some gentlemanly, companionable souls, capable of genuine tranquillity and virtue. End of Section 14. Sketch 6. Barrington Isle and the Buccaneers. Section 15 of the Piazza Tales by Herman Melville. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 5G. The Encantadas, Sketch 7th. Charles Island and the Dog King. So, with outrageous cry, 1,000 villains round about him swarmed out of the rocks and caves adjoining nigh, vile caitiff wretches, ragged, rude, deformed, all threatening death, all in strange manner armed, some with unwieldy clubs, some with long spears, some rusty knives, some staves in fire warmed. We will not be of any occupation. Let such vile vassals, born to base vocation, drudge in the world, and for their living droil, which have no wit to live withouten toil. Southwest of Barrington lies Charles Isle, and hereby hangs a history which I gathered long ago from a shipmate learned in all the lore of outlandish life. During the successful revolt of the Spanish provinces from Old Spain, there fought on behalf of Peru a certain Creole adventurer from Cuba, who, by his bravery and good fortune, at length advanced himself to high rank in the patriot army. The war being ended, Peru found itself, like many valorous gentlemen, free and independent enough, but with few shot in the locker. In other words, Peru had not wherewithal to pay off its troops. But the Creole, I forget his name, volunteered to take his pay in lands. So they told him he might have his pick of the Enchanted Isles, which were then, as they still remain, the nominal appanage of Peru. The soldier straightway embarks thither, explores the group, returns to Callao, and says he will take the deed of Charles Isle. Moreover, this deed must stipulate that thenceforth Charles Isle is not only the sole property of the Creole, but is forever free of Peru, even as Peru of Spain. To be short, this adventurer procures himself to be made in effect supreme lord of the island, one of the princes of the powers of the earth. Note 1. The American Spaniards have long been in the habit of making presents of islands to deserving individuals. The pilot Juan Fernandez procured a deed of the isle named after him, and for some years resided there before Selkirk came. It is supposed, however, that he eventually contracted the blues upon his princely property, for after a time he returned to the Main, and, as report goes, became a very garrulous barber in the city of Lima. He now sends forth a proclamation inviting subjects to his as yet unpopulated kingdom. Some 80 souls, men and women, respond, and being provided by their leader with necessaries and tools of various sorts, together with a few cattle and goats, take ship for the promised land, the last arrival on board prior to sailing being the Creole himself, accompanied, strange to say, by a disciplined cavalry company of large, grim dogs. These, it was observed on the passage, refusing to consort with the emigrants, remained aristocratically grouped around their master on the elevated quarter deck, casting disdainful glances forward upon the inferior rabble there, much as from the ramparts the soldiers of a garrison thrown into a conquered town eye the inglorious citizen mob over which they are set to watch. Now, Charles Isle not only resembles Barrington Isle in being much more inhabitable than other parts of the group, but it is double the size of Barrington, say 40 or 50 miles in circuit. Safely debarked at last, the company, under direction of their lord and patron, forthwith proceeded to build their capital city. They make considerable advance in the way of walls of clinkers and lava floors, nicely sanded with cinders. On the least barren hills they pasture their cattle, while the goats, adventurers by nature, explore the far inland solitudes for a scanty livelihood of lofty herbage. Meantime, abundance of fish and tortoises supply their other wants. The disorders incident to settling all primitive regions, in the present case, were heightened by the peculiarly untoward character of many of the pilgrims. His Majesty was forced at last to proclaim martial law, and actually hunted and shot with his own hand several of his rebellious subjects, who, with most questionable intentions, had clandestinely encamped in the interior, whence they stole by night to prowl barefooted on tiptoe round the precincts of the lava palace. It is to be remarked, however, that prior to such stern proceedings the more reliable men had been judiciously picked out for an infantry bodyguard, subordinate to the cavalry bodyguard of dogs. But the state of politics in this unhappy nation may be somewhat imagined from the circumstance that all who were not of the bodyguard were downright plotters and malignant traitors. At length the death penalty was tacitly abolished, owing to the timely thought that were strict sportsman's justice to be dispensed among such subjects, ere long the Nimrod king would have little or no remaining game to shoot. The human part of the Life Guard was now disbanded and set to work cultivating the soil and raising potatoes, the regular army now solely consisting of the dog regiment. These, as I have heard, were of a singularly ferocious character, though by severe training rendered docile to their master. Armed to the teeth, the Creole now goes in state, surrounded by his canine janissaries, whose terrific bayings prove quite as serviceable as bayonets in keeping down the surgings of revolt. But the census of the isle, sadly lessened by the dispensation of justice, and not materially recruited by matrimony, began to fill his mind with sad mistrust. Some way the population must be increased. Now, from its possessing a little water, and its comparative pleasantness of aspect, Charles Isle at this period was occasionally visited by foreign whalers. These his Majesty had always levied upon for port charges, thereby contributing to his revenue. But now he had additional designs. By insidious arts he, from time to time, cajoles certain sailors to desert their ships and enlist beneath his banner. Soon as missed, their captains crave permission to go and hunt them up, whereupon his Majesty first hides them very carefully away, and then freely permits the search. In consequence the delinquents are never found, and the ships retire without them. Thus, by a two-edged policy of this crafty monarch, foreign nations were crippled in the number of their subjects, and his own were greatly multiplied. He particularly petted these renegado strangers, but alas for the deep-laid schemes of ambitious princes, and alas for the vanity of glory! As the foreign-born Praetorians, unwisely introduced into the Roman state, and still more unwisely made favorites of the emperors, at last insulted and overturned the throne, even so these lawless mariners, with all the rest of the bodyguard and all the populace, broke out into a terrible mutiny, and defied their master. He marched against them with all his dogs. A deadly battle ensued upon the beach. It raged for 3 hours, the dogs fighting with determined valor, and and the sailors reckless of everything but victory. 3 men and 13 dogs were left dead upon the field, many on both sides were wounded, and the king was forced to fly with the remainder of his canine regiment. The enemy pursued, stoning the dogs with their master into the wilderness of the interior. Discontinuing the pursuit, the victors returned to the village on the shore, stove the spirit casks, and proclaimed a republic. The dead men were interred with the honors of war, and the dead dogs ignominiously thrown into the sea. At last, forced by stress of suffering, the fugitive Creole came down from the hills and offered to treat for peace, but the rebels refused it on any other terms than his unconditional banishment. Accordingly, the next ship that arrived carried away the ex-king to Peru. The history of the king of Charles Island furnishes another illustration of the difficulty of colonizing barren islands with unprincipled pilgrims. Doubtless for a long time the exiled monarch, pensively ruralizing in Peru, which afforded him a safe asylum in his calamity, watched every arrival from the Encantadas to hear news of the failure of the republic, the consequent penitence of the rebels, and his own recall to royalty. Doubtless he deemed the republic but a miserable experiment which would soon explode. But no, the insurgents had confederated themselves into a democracy, neither Grecian, Roman, nor American. Nay, it was no democracy at all, but a permanent riotocracy, which gloried in having no law but lawlessness. Great inducements being offered to deserters, their ranks were swelled by accessions of scamps from every ship which touched their shores. Charles Island was proclaimed the asylum of the oppressed of all navies. Each runaway tar was hailed as a martyr in the cause of freedom, and became immediately installed a ragged citizen of this universal nation. In vain the captains of absconding seamen strove to regain them. Their new compatriots were ready to give any number of ornamental eyes in their behalf. They had few cannon, but their fists were not to be trifled with. So at last it came to pass that no vessels acquainted with the character of that country durst touch there, however sorely in want of refreshment. It became anathema, a sea Alsatia, the unassailed lurking place of all sorts of desperadoes, who, in the name of liberty, did just what they pleased. They continually fluctuated in their numbers. Sailors, deserting ships at other islands, or in boats at sea anywhere in that vicinity, steered for Charles Isle as to their sure home of refuge, while, sated with the life of the isle, numbers from time to time crossed the water to the neighboring ones, and there presenting themselves to strange captains as shipwrecked seamen, often succeeded in getting on board vessels bound to the Spanish coast, and having a compassionate purse made up for them on landing there. One warm night, during my first visit to the group, our ship was floating along in languid stillness, when some one on the forecastle shouted, "Light ho!" We looked and saw a beacon burning on some obscure land off the beam. Our third mate was not intimate with this part of the world. Going to the captain, he said, "Sir, shall I put off in a boat? There must be shipwrecked men." The captain laughed rather grimly as, shaking his fist towards the beacon, he rapped out an oath and said, "No, no, you precious rascals! You don't juggle one of my boats ashore this blessed night. You do well, you thieves! You do benevolently to hoist a light yonder as on a dangerous shoal. It tempts no wise man to pull off and see what's the matter, but bids him steer small and keep off shore. That is Charles Island. Brace up, Mr. Mate, and keep the light astern." End of Section 15. Sketch 7th. Charles Isle and the Dog King. Section 16 of the Piazza Tales by Herman Melville. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 5H. The Encantadas. Sketch 8th. Norfolk Isle and the Chola Widow. At last they in an island did espy A seemly woman sitting by the shore, That with great sorrow and sad agony Seemed some great misfortune to deplore, And loud to them for succor called evermore. Black his eye as the midnight sky, White his neck as the driven snow, Red his cheek as the morning light, Cold he lies in the ground below. My love is dead, Gone to his deathbed, yes, all under the cactus tree. Each lonely scene shall thee restore, For thee the tear be duly shed, Beloved till life can charm no more, And mourned till pity's self be dead. Far to the northeast of Charles Isle, sequestered from the rest, lies Norfolk Isle, and however insignificant to most voyagers, to me, through sympathy, that lone island has become a spot made sacred by the strangest trials of humanity. It was my first visit to the Encantadas. 2 days had been spent ashore in hunting tortoises. There was not time to capture many, so on the third afternoon we loosed our sails. We were just in the act of getting under way, the uprooted anchor yet suspended and invisibly swaying beneath the wave, as the good ship gradually turned her heel to leave the isle behind, when the seaman who heaved with me at the windlass paused suddenly, and directed my attention to something moving on the land, not along the beach, but somewhat back, fluttering from a height. In view of the sequel of this little story, be it here narrated how it came to pass that an object which, partly from its being so small, was quite lost to every other man on board, still caught the eye of my handspike companion. The rest of the crew, myself included, merely stood up to our spikes in heaving, whereas, unwontedly exhilarated at every turn of the ponderous windlass, my belted comrade leaped atop of it, with might and main giving a downward, thuey, perpendicular heave, his raised eye bent in cheery animation upon the slowly receding shore. Being high lifted above all others was the reason he perceived the object, otherwise unperceivable, and this elevation of his eye was owing to the elevation of his spirits, and this again, for truth must out, to a dram of Peruvian pisco, in guerdon for some kindness done, secretly administered to him that morning by our mulatto steward. Now, certainly, pisco does a deal of mischief in the world, yet, seeing that, in the present case, it was the means, though indirect, of rescuing a human being from the most dreadful fate, must we not also needs admit that sometimes pisco does a deal of good? Glancing across the water in the direction pointed out, I saw some white thing hanging from an inland rock, perhaps half a mile from the sea. "It is a bird, a white winged bird, perhaps. No, it is a handkerchief." "Aye, a handkerchief," echoed my comrade, and with a louder shout apprised the captain. Quickly now, like the running out and training of a great gun, the long cabin spyglass was thrust through the mizzen rigging from the high platform of the poop, whereupon a human figure was plainly seen upon the inland rock, eagerly waving towards us what seemed to be the handkerchief. Our captain was a prompt, good fellow. Dropping the glass, he lustily ran forward, ordering the anchor to be dropped again, hands to stand by a boat and lower away. In a half hour's time the swift boat returned. It went with 6 and came back with 7, and the 7th was a woman. It is not artistic heartlessness, but I wish I could but draw in crayons, for this woman was a most touching sight, and crayons, tracing softly melancholy lines, would best depict the mournful image of the dark damasked chola widow. Her story was soon told, and though given in her own strange language, was as quickly understood, for our captain, from long trading on the Chilean coast, was well versed in the Spanish. A cholo, or half-breed Indian woman of Payta in Peru. 3 years gone by, with her young new-wedded husband Felipe, of pure Castilian blood, and her one only Indian brother, Truxil, Junilla had taken passage on the Main in a French whaler, commanded by a joyous man, which vessel, bound to the cruising grounds beyond the Enchanted Isles, proposed passing close by their vicinity. The object of the little party was to procure tortoise oil, a fluid which for its great purity and delicacy is held in high estimation wherever known, and it is well known all along this part of the Pacific coast. With a chest of clothes, tools, cooking utensils, a rude apparatus for trying out the oil, some casks of biscuit and other things, not omitting 2 favorite dogs, of which faithful animal all the Cholos are very fond, Junilla and her companions were safely landed at their chosen place. The Frenchman, according to the contract made ere sailing, engaged to take them off upon returning from a 4 months' cruise in the westward seas, which interval the 3 adventurers deemed quite sufficient for their purposes. On the isle's lone beach they paid him in silver for their passage out, the stranger having declined to carry them at all except upon that condition, though willing to take every means to ensure the due fulfillment of his promise. Felipe had striven hard to have this payment put off to the period of the ship's return, but in vain. Still they thought they had, in another way, ample pledge of the good faith of the Frenchman. It was arranged that the expenses of the passage home should not be payable in silver, but in tortoises, 100 tortoises ready captured to the returning captain's hand. These the Cholos meant to secure after their own work was done, against the probable time of the Frenchman's coming back, and no doubt in prospect already felt that in those 100 tortoises, now somewhere ranging the isle's interior, they possessed 100 hostages. Enough. The vessel sailed. The gazing 3 on shore answered the loud glee of the singing crew, and ere evening the French craft was hull down in the distant sea, its masts 3 faintest lines which quickly faded from Junilla's eye. The stranger had given a blithesome promise, and anchored it with oaths, but oaths and anchors equally will drag. Naught else abides on fickle earth but unkept promises of joy. Contrary winds from out unstable skies, or contrary moods of his more varying mind, or shipwreck and sudden death in solitary waves. Whatever was the cause, the blithe stranger never was seen again. Yet, however dire a calamity was here in store, misgivings of it ere due time never disturbed the Cholo's busy mind, now all intent upon the toilsome matter which had brought them hither. Nay, by swift doom, coming like the thief at night, ere 7 weeks went by 2 of the little party were removed from all anxieties of land or sea. No more they sought to gaze with feverish fear, or still more feverish hope, beyond the present's horizon line, but into the furthest future their own silent spirits sailed. By persevering labor beneath that burning sun, Felipe and Truxil had brought down to their hut many scores of tortoises, and tried out the oil, when, elated with their good success, and to reward themselves for such hard work, they too hastily made a catamaran, or Indian raft, much used on the Spanish Main, and merrily started on a fishing trip, just without, a long reef with many jagged gaps, running parallel with the shore about half a mile from it. By some bad tide or hap, or natural negligence of joyfulness, for though they could not be heard, yet by their gestures they seemed singing at the time, forced in deep water against that iron bar, the ill-made catamaran was overset, and came all to pieces, when dashed by broad-chested swells between their broken logs and the sharp teeth of the reef, both adventurers perished before Junilla's eyes. Before Junilla's eyes they sank. The real woe of this event passed before her sight as some sham tragedy on the stage. She was seated on a rude bower among the withered thickets crowning a lofty cliff a little back from the beach. The thickets were so disposed that in looking upon the sea at large she peered out from among the branches as from the lattice of a high balcony. But upon the day we speak of here, the better to watch the adventure of those two hearts she loved, Hunilla had withdrawn the branches to one side and held them so. They formed an oval frame, through which the bluely boundless sea rolled like a painted one. And there the invisible painter painted to her view the wave tossed and disjointed raft, its once level logs slantingly upheaved as raking masts, and the four struggling arms indistinguishable among them, and then all subsided into smooth flowing creamy waters, slowly drifting the splintered wreck, while first and last no sound of any sort was heard. Death in a silent picture, a dream of the eye, such vanishing shapes as the mirage shows. So instant was the scene, so trance-like its mild pictorial effect, so distant from her blasted bower and her common sense of things, that Hunilla gazed and gazed, nor raised a finger or a wail, but as good to sit thus dumb, in stupor staring on that dumb show, for all that otherwise might be done. With half a mile of sea between, how could her two enchanted arms aid those four fated ones? The distance long, the time one sand. After the lightning is beheld, what fool shall stay the thunderbolt? Felipe's body was washed ashore, but Truxell's never came, only his gay braided hat of golden straw, that same sunflower thing he waved to her, pushing from the strand, and now to the last gallant it still saluted her. But Felipe's body floated to the marge, with one arm encircling outstretched. Lock-jawed in grim death, the lover-husband softly clasped his bride, true to her even in death's dream. Ah, Heaven, when man thus keeps his faith, wilt thou be faithless, who created the faithful one? But they cannot break faith who never plighted it. It needs not to be said what nameless misery now wrapped the lonely widow. In telling her own story she passed this almost entirely over, simply recounting the event. Construe the comment of her features as you might, from her mere words little would you have weened that Hunilla was herself the heroine of her tale. But not thus did she defraud us of our tears. All hearts bled that grief could be so brave. She but showed us her soul's lid, and the strange ciphers thereon engraved. All within, with pride's timidity, was withheld. Yet was there one exception. Holding out her small olive hand before her captain, she said in mild and slowest Spanish, "Senor, I buried him," then paused, struggled as against the writhed coilings of a snake, and cringing suddenly, leapt up, repeating in impassioned pain, "I buried him, my life, my soul." Doubtless it was by half unconscious, automatic motions of her hands that this heavy-hearted one performed the final office for Felipe, and planted a rude cross of withered sticks no green ones might be had at the head of that lonely grave, where rested now in lasting uncomplaint and quiet haven he whom untranquil seas had overthrown. But some dull sense of another body that should be interred, of another cross that should hallow another grave, unmade as yet, some dull anxiety and pain touching her undiscovered brother, now haunted the oppressed Hunilla. Her hands fresh from the burial earth, she slowly went back to the beach, with unshaped purposes wandering there, her spellbound eye bent upon the incessant waves. But they bore nothing to her but a dirge, which maddened her to think that murderers should mourn. As time went by and these things came less dreamingly to her mind, the strong persuasions of her Romish faith, which sets peculiar store by consecrated urns, prompted her to resume in waking earnest that pious search which had but been begun as in somnambulism. Day after day, week after week, she trod the cindery beach, till at length a double motive edged every eager glance. With equal longing she now looked for the living and the dead, the brother and the captain. Alike vanished, never to return. Little accurate note of time had Hunila taken under such emotions as were hers, and little, outside herself, served for calendar or dial. As to poor Crusoe in the selfsame sea, no saint's bell pealed forth the lapse of week or month. Each day went by unchallenged. No chanticleer announced those sultry dawns, no lowing herds those poisonous nights. All wanted and steadily recurring sounds, human or humanized by sweet fellowship with man, but one stirred that torrid trance, the cry of dogs, save which naught but the rolling sea invaded it, an all-pervading monotone, and to the widow that was the least loved voice she could have heard. No wonder that, as her thoughts now wandered to the unreturning ship, and were beaten back again, the hope against hope so struggled in her soul that at length she desperately said, "Not yet, not yet! My foolish heart runs on too fast." So she forced patience for some further weeks. But to those whom earth's sure indraft draws, patience or impatience is still the same. Hunila now sought to settle precisely in her mind to an hour how long it was since the ship had sailed, and then, with the same precision, how long a space remained to pass. But this proved impossible. What present day or month it was she could not say. Time was her labyrinth, in which Hunila was entirely lost. And now follows. Against my own purposes a pause descends upon me here. One knows not whether nature doth not impose some secrecy upon him who has been privy to certain things. At least it is to be doubted whether to be good to blazon such. If some books are deemed most baneful and their sale forbid, how then with deadlier facts not dreams of doting men? Those whom books will hurt will not be proof against events. Events, not books, should be forbid. But in all things man sows upon the wind, which bloweth just there whither it listeth. For ill or good man cannot know. Often ill comes from the good, as good from ill. When Hunila dire sight it is to see some silken beast long dally with a golden lizard ere she devour; more terrible to see how feline fate will sometimes dally with a human soul, and by a nameless magic make it repulse a sane despair with a hope which is but mad. Unwittingly I imp this catlike thing, sporting with the heart of him who reads, for if he feel not he reads in vain. "The ship sails this day to day," at last said Hunila to herself. "This gives me certain time to stand on. Without certainty I go mad. In loose ignorance I have hoped and hoped. Now in firm knowledge I will but wait. Now I live and no longer perish in bewilderings. Holy Virgin, aid me! Thou wilt waft back the ship. O past length of weary weeks all to be dragged over, to buy the certainty of to day, I freely give ye, though I tear ye from me." As mariners, tossed in tempest on some desolate ledge, patch them a boat out of the remnants of their vessel's wreck, and launch it in the selfsame waves, see here Hunila, this lone shipwrecked soul, out of treachery invoking trust. Humanity, thou strong thing, I worship thee, not in the laureled victor, but in this vanquished one. Truly Hunila leaned upon a reed, a real one, no metaphor, a real Eastern reed, a piece of hollow cane, drifted from unknown isles, and found upon the beach, its once jagged ends rubbed smoothly even as by sandpaper, its golden glazing gone. long ground between the sea and land, upper and nether stone. The unvarnished substance was filed bare, and wore another polish now, one with itself, the polish of its agony. Circular lines at intervals cut all around this surface, divided it into 6 panels of unequal length. In the first were scored the days, each 10th one marked by a longer and deeper notch. The second was scored by the number of seafowl eggs for sustenance, picked out from the rocky nests. The third, how many fish had been caught from the shore. The fourth, how many small tortoises found inland. The fifth, how many days of sun. The sixth, of clouds, which last of the two was the greater one. Long night of busy numbering, misery's mathematics, too weary her too wakeful soul to sleep, yet sleep for that was none. The panel of the days was deeply worn, the long tenths notches half effaced, as alphabets of the blind. 10,000 times the longing widow had traced her fingers over the bamboo, dull flute which played on, gave no sound, as if counting birds flown by in air would hasten tortoises creeping through the woods. After the 180th day no further mark was seen. That last one was the faintest, as the first the deepest. "There were more days," said our captain, "many, many more. Why did you not go on and notch them too, Hunilla?" "Senor, ask me not." "And meantime, did no other vessel pass the isle?" "Nay, senor, but—" "You do not speak. But what, Hunilla?" "Ask me not, senor." "You saw ships pass far away. You waved to them. They passed on. Was that it, Hunilla?" "Senor, be it as you say." Braced against her woe, Hunilla would not, durst not, trust the weakness of her tongue. Then when our captain asked whether any whale boats had but no, I will not file this thing complete for scoffing souls to quote, and call it firm proof upon their side. The half shall here remain untold. Those 2 unnamed events which befell Hunilla on this isle, let them abide between her and her God. In nature as in law it may be libelous to speak some truths. Still, how it was that, although our vessel had lain 3 days anchored nigh the isle, its one human tenant should not have discovered us till just upon the point of sailing, never to revisit so lone and far a spot, this needs explaining ere the sequel come. The place where the French captain had landed the little party was on the further and opposite end of the isle. There, too, it was that they had afterward built their hut. Nor did the widow in her solitude desert the spot where her loved ones had dwelt with her, and where the dearest of the twain now slept in his last long sleep, and all her plaints awakened him not, and he of husbands the most faithful during life. Now high, broken land rises between the opposite extremities of the isle. A ship anchored at one side is invisible from the other. Neither is the isle so small but a considerable company might wander for days through the wilderness of one side, and never be seen, or their halloos heard, by any stranger holding aloof on the other. Hence Hunilla, who naturally associated the possible coming of ships with her own part of the isle, might to the end have remained quite ignorant of the presence of our vessel, were it not for a mysterious presentiment, borne to her, so our mariners averred, by this isle's enchanted air. Nor did the widow's answer undo the thought. "How did you come to cross the isle this morning, then, Hunilla?" said our captain. "Senor, something came flitting by me. It touched my cheek, my heart, senor." "What do you say, Hunilla?" "I have said, senor, something came through the air." It was a narrow chance. For when in crossing the isle Hunilla gained the high land in the center, she must then for the first have perceived our masts, and also marked that their sails were being loosed, perhaps even heard the echoing chorus of the windlass song. The strange ship was about to sail, and she behind. With all haste she now descends the height on the hither side, but soon loses sight of the ship among the sunken jungles at the mountain's base. She struggles on through the withered branches, which seek at every step to bar her path, till she comes to the isolated rock, still some way from the water. This she climbs to reassure herself. The ship is still in plainest sight. But now, worn out with overtension, Hunilla all but faints. She fears to step down from her giddy perch. She is fain to pause, there where she is, and, as a last resort, catches the turban from her head, unfurls, and waves it over the jungles towards us. During the telling of her story the mariners formed a voiceless circle round Hunilla and the captain, and when at length the word was given to man the fastest boat, and pull round to the isle's thither side, to bring away Hunilla's chest and the tortoise oil, such alacrity of both cheery and sad obedience seldom before was seen. Little ado was made. Already the anchor had been recommitted to the bottom, and the ship swung calmly to it. But Hunilla insisted upon accompanying the boat as indispensable pilot to her hidden hut. So, being refreshed with the best the steward could supply, she started with us. Nor did ever any wife of the most famous admiral, in her husband's barge, receive more silent reverence of respect than poor Hunilla from this boat's crew. Rounding many a vitreous cape and bluff, in 2 hours' time we shot inside the fatal reef, wound into a secret cove, looked up along a green many-gabled lava wall, and saw the island's solitary dwelling. It hung upon an impending cliff, sheltered on 2 sides by tangled thickets, and half screened from view in front by jutting of the rude stairway, which climbed the precipice from the sea. Built of canes, it was thatched with long mildewed grass. It seemed an abandoned hayrick, whose haymakers were now no more. The roof inclined but one way, the eaves coming to within 2 feet of the ground, and here was a simple apparatus to collect the dews, or rather doubly distilled and finest winnowed rains, which in mercy or in mockery the night skies sometimes drop upon these blighted encantadas. All along beneath the eaves a spotted sheet, quite weather-stained, was spread, pinned to short upright stakes set in the shallow sand. A small clinker thrown into the cloth weighed its middle down, thereby straining all moisture into a calabash placed below. This vessel supplied each drop of water ever drunk upon the isle by the cholos. Hunilla told us the calabash would sometimes, but not often, be half filled overnight. It held 6 quarts, perhaps. "But," said she, "we were used to thirst. At Sandy Peta, where I live, no shower from heaven ever fell. All the water there is brought on mules from the inland vales." Tied among the thickets were some 20 moaning tortoises, supplying Hunilla's lonely larder, while hundreds of vast tableted black bucklers, like displaced, shattered tombstones of dark slate, were also scattered round. These were the skeleton backs of those great tortoises from which Felipe and Truxil had made their precious oil. Several large calabashes and 2 goodly kegs were filled with it. In a pot near by were the caked crusts of a quantity which had been permitted to evaporate. "They meant to have strained it off next day," said Hunilla, as she turned aside. I forgot to mention the most singular sight of all, though the first that greeted us after landing. Some 10 small, soft-haired, ringleted dogs, of a beautiful breed, peculiar to Peru, set up a concert of glad welcomings when we gained the beach, which was responded to by Hunilla. Some of these dogs had, since their widowhood, been born upon the isle, the progeny of the 2 brought from Payta. Owing to the jagged steeps and pitfalls, tortuous thickets, sunken clefts, and perilous intricacies of all sorts in the interior, Hunilla, admonished by the loss of one favorite among them, never allowed these delicate creatures to follow her in her occasional bird's nest climbs and other wanderings, so that, through long habituation, they offered not to follow when that morning she crossed the land, and her own soul was then too full of other things to heed their lingering behind. Yet all along she had so clung to them that, besides what moisture they lapped up at early daybreak from the small scoop holes among the adjacent rocks, she had shared the dew of her calabash among them, never laying by any considerable store against those prolonged and utter droughts which, in some disastrous seasons, warp these isles. Having pointed out at our desire what few things she would like transported to the ship, her chest, the oil, not omitting the live tortoises which she intended for a grateful present to our captain, we immediately set to work, carrying them to the boat down the long sloping stair of deeply shadowed rock. While my comrades were thus employed, I looked, and Hunilla had disappeared. It was not curiosity alone, but it seems to me something different mingled with it, which prompted me to drop my tortoise and once more gaze slowly around. I remembered the husband buried by Hunilla's hands. A narrow pathway led into a dense part of the thickets. Following it through many mazes, I came out upon a small, round, open space, deeply chambered there. The mound rose in the middle, a bare heap of finest sand, like that unverdured heap found at the bottom of an hourglass run out. At its head stood the cross of withered sticks, the dry, peeled bark still fraying from it, its transverse limb tied up with rope, and forlornly adroop in the silent air. Hunilla was partly prostrate upon the grave, her dark head bowed and lost in her long loosened Indian hair, her hands extended to the cross foot, with a little brass crucifix clasped between, a crucifix worn featureless, like an ancient graven knocker long plied in vain. She did not see me, and I made no noise, but slid aside and left the spot. A few moments ere all was ready for our going, she reappeared among us. I looked into her eyes, but saw no tear. There was something which seemed strangely haughty in her air, and yet it was the air of woe, a Spanish and an Indian grief which would not visibly lament. Pride's height, in vain abased to proneness on the rack, nature's pride subduing nature's torture. Like pages, the small and silken dogs surrounded her as she slowly descended towards the beach. She caught the two most eager creatures in her arms, "Mia tita, mia tomotita," and fondling them, inquired how many could we take on board. The mate commanded the boat's crew, not a hard-hearted man, but his way of life had been such that in most things, even in the smallest, simple utility was his leading motive. "We cannot take them all, Hunilla. Our supplies are short. The winds are unreliable. We may be a good many days going to Tombez. So take those you have, Hunilla, but no more." She was in the boat. The oarsmen, too, were seated, all save one, who stood ready to push off and then spring himself. With the sagacity of their race, the dogs now seemed aware that they were in the very instant of being deserted upon a barren strand. The gunwales of the boat were high. Its prow, presented inland, was lifted, so owing to the water, which they seemed instinctively to shun, the dogs could not well leap into the little craft. But their busy paws hard scraped the prow, as it had been some farmer's door shutting them out from shelter in a winter storm. A clamorous agony of alarm. They did not howl or whine. They all but spoke. "Push off! Give way!" cried the mate. The boat gave one heavy drag and lurch, and next moment shot swiftly from the beach, turned on her heel, and sped. The dogs ran howling along the water's marge, now pausing to gaze at the flying boat, then motioning as if to leap in chase, but mysteriously withheld themselves, and again ran howling along the beach. Had they been human beings, hardly would they have more vividly inspired the sense of desolation. The oars were plied as confederate feathers of two wings. No one spoke. I looked back upon the beach, and then upon Hunilla, but her face was set in a stern, dusky calm. The dogs crouching in her lap vainly licked her rigid hands. She never looked behind her, but sat motionless till we turned a promontory of the coast and lost all sights and sounds astern. She seemed as one who, having experienced the sharpest of mortal pangs, was henceforth content to have all lesser heartstrings riven one by one. To Hunilla, pain seemed so necessary that pain in other beings, though by love and sympathy made her own, was unrepiningly to be borne. A heart of yearning in a frame of steel, a heart of earthly yearning, frozen by the frost which falleth from the sky. The sequel is soon told. After a long passage vexed by calms and baffling winds, we made the little port of Tombez in Peru, there to recruit the ship. Payta was not very distant. Our captain sold the tortoise oil to a Tombez merchant, and adding to the silver a contribution from all hands, gave it to our silent passenger, who knew not what the mariners had done. The last scene of lone Hunilla, she was passing into Payta town, riding upon a small gray ass, and before her, on the ass's shoulders, she eyed the jointed workings of the beast's armorial cross. End of Section 16, Sketch 8th, Norfolk Isle and the Chola Widow. Section 17 of the Piazza Tales by Herman Melville. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 5I, The Encantadas, Sketch 9th, Hood's Isle and the Hermit Oberlus. That darksome glen they enter, where they find that cursed man low sitting on the ground, musing full sadly in his sullen mind. His grisly locks, long gronen and unbound, disordered hung about his shoulders round, and hid his face, through which his hollow eyne looked deadly dull, and stared as astound. His raw-boned cheeks, through penury and pine, were shrunk into the jaws, as he did never dine. His garments naught but many ragged clouts, with thorns together pinned and patched reeds, the which his naked sides he wrapped abouts. Southeast of Crossman's Isle lies Hood's Isle, or McCain's Beclouded Isle, and upon its south side is a vitreous cove with a wide strand of dark pounded black lava called Black Beach, or Oberlus's Landing. It might fitly have been styled Charon's. It received its name from a wild white creature who spent many years here, in the person of a European, bringing into this savage region qualities more diabolical than are to be found among any of the surrounding cannibals. About a half-century ago Oberlus deserted at the above-named island, then as now a solitude. He built himself a den of lava and clinkers about a mile from the landing, subsequently called after him, in a vale or expanded gulch, containing here and there among the rocks about 2 acres of soil capable of rude cultivation, the only place on the isle not too blasted for that purpose. Here he succeeded in raising a sort of degenerate potatoes and pumpkins, which from time to time he exchanged with needy whalemen passing for spirits or dollars. His appearance, from all accounts, was that of the victim of some malignant sorceress. He seemed to have drunk of Circe's cup, beast-like, rags insufficient to hide his nakedness, his befreckled skin blistered by continual exposure to the sun, nose flat, countenance contorted, heavy, earthy, hair and beard unshorn, profuse, and of fiery red. He struck strangers much as if he were a volcanic creature thrown up by the same convulsion which exploded into sight the isle. All bespatched and coiled asleep in his lonely lava den among the mountains, he looked, they say, as a heaped drift of withered leaves, torn from autumn trees, and so left in some hidden nook by the whirling halt for an instant of a fierce night wind, which then ruthlessly sweeps on somewhere else to repeat the capricious act. It is also reported to have been the strangest sight, this same Oberlus, of a sultry, cloudy morning, hidden under his shocking old black tarpaulin hat, hoeing potatoes among the lava. So warped and crooked was his strange nature that the very handle of his hoe seemed gradually to have shrunk and twisted in his grasp, being a wretched bent stick, elbowed more like a savage's war sickle than a civilized hoe handle. It was his mysterious custom upon a first encounter with a stranger ever to present his back, possibly because that was his better side, since it revealed the least. If the encounter chanced in his garden, as it sometimes did, the new landed strangers going from the seaside straight through the gorge to hunt up the queer green grocer reported doing business here, Oberlus for a time hoed on, unmindful of all greeting, jovial or bland. As the curious stranger would turn to face him, the recluse, hoe in hand, as diligently would avert himself, bowed over and sullenly revolving round his Murphy Hill. Thus far for hoeing. When planting, his whole aspect and all his gestures were so malevolently and uselessly sinister and secret that he seemed rather in act of dropping poison into wells than potatoes into soil. But among his lesser and more harmless marvels was an idea he ever had that his visitors came equally as well led by longings to behold the mighty hermit Oberlus in his royal state of solitude as simply to obtain potatoes or find whatever company might be upon a barren isle. It seems incredible that such a being should possess such vanity. A misanthrope be conceited, but he really had his notion, and upon the strength of it often gave himself amusing airs to captains. But after all, this is somewhat of a piece with the well-known eccentricity of some convicts, proud of that very hatefulness which makes them notorious. At other times another unaccountable whim would seize him, and he would long dodge advancing strangers round the clinkered corners of his hut. Sometimes, like a stealthy bear, he would slink through the withered thickets up the mountains, and refuse to see the human face. Except his occasional visitors from the sea, for a long period, the only companions of Oberlus were the crawling tortoises, and he seemed more than degraded to their level, having no desires for a time beyond theirs, unless it were for the stupor brought on by drunkenness. But sufficiently debased as he appeared, there yet lurked in him, only awaiting occasion for discovery, a still further proneness. Indeed, the sole superiority of Oberlus over the tortoises was his possession of a larger capacity of degradation, and along with that something like an intelligent will to it. Moreover, what is about to be revealed perhaps will show that selfish ambition, or the love of rule for its own sake, far from being the peculiar infirmity of noble minds, is shared by beings which have no mind at all. No creatures are so selfishly tyrannical as some brutes, as anyone who has observed the tenants of the pasture must occasionally have observed. "This island's mine by Sycorax, my mother," said Oberlus to himself, glaring round upon his haggard solitude. By some means, barter or theft, for in those days ships at intervals still kept touching at his landing, he obtained an old musket with a few charges of powder and ball. Possessed of arms, he was stimulated to enterprise as a tiger that first feels the coming of its claws. The long habit of sole dominion over every object round him, his almost unbroken solitude, his never encountering humanity except on terms of misanthropic independence or mercantile craftiness, And even such encounters being comparatively but rare, all this must have gradually nourished in him a vast idea of his own importance, together with a pure animal sort of scorn for all the rest of the universe. The unfortunate Creole, who enjoyed his brief term of royalty at Charles Isle, was perhaps in some degree influenced by not unworthy motives, such as prompt other adventurous spirits to lead colonists into distant regions and assume political preeminence over them. His summary execution of many of his Peruvians is quite pardonable, considering the desperate characters he had to deal with, while his offering canine battle to the banded rebels seems under the circumstances altogether just. But for this King Oberlus and what shortly follows, no shade of palliation can be given. He acted out of mere delight in tyranny and cruelty, by virtue of a quality in him inherited from Sycorax, his mother. Armed now with that shocking blunderbuss, strong in the thought of being master of that horrid isle, he panted for a chance to prove his potency upon the first specimen of humanity which should fall unbefriended into his hands. Nor was he long without it. One day he spied a boat upon the beach, with one man, a negro, standing by it. Some distance off was a ship, and Oberlus immediately knew how matters stood. The vessel had put in for wood, and the boat's crew had gone into the thickets for it. From a convenient spot he kept watch of the boat, till presently a straggling company appeared loaded with billets. Throwing these on the beach, they again went into the thickets while the negro proceeded to load the boat. Oberlus now makes all haste and accosts the negro, who, aghast at seeing any living being inhabiting such a solitude, and especially so horrific a one, immediately falls into a panic, not at all lessened by the ursine suavity of Oberlus, who begs the favor of assisting him in his labors. The negro stands with several billets on his shoulder, in act of shouldering others, and Oberlus, with a short cord concealed in his bosom, kindly proceeds to lift those other billets to their place. In so doing, he persists in keeping behind the negro, who, rightly suspicious of this, in vain dodges about to gain the front of Oberlus. But Oberlus dodges also, till at last, weary of his bootless attempt at treachery, or fearful of being surprised by the remainder of the party, Oberlus runs off a little space to a bush, and, fetching his blunderbuss, savagely commands the negro to desist work and follow him. He refuses, whereupon, presenting his piece, Oberlus snaps at him. Luckily the blunderbuss misses fire, but by this time, frightened out of his wits, the negro, upon a second intrepid summons, drops his billets, surrenders at discretion, and follows on. By a narrow defile familiar to him Oberlus speedily removes out of sight of the water. On their way up the mountains he exultingly informs the negro that henceforth he is to work for him and be his slave, and that his treatment would entirely depend on his future conduct. But Oberlus, deceived by the first impulsive cowardice of the black, in an evil moment slackens his vigilance. Passing through a narrow way, and perceiving his leader quite off his guard, the negro, a powerful fellow, suddenly grasps him in his arms, throws him down, wrests his musketoon from him, ties his hands with the monster's own cord, shoulders him, and returns with him down to the boat. When the rest of the party arrive, Oberlus is carried on board the ship. This proved an Englishman and a smuggler, a sort of craft not apt to be over charitable. Oberlus is severely whipped, then handcuffed, taken ashore, and compelled to make known his habitation and produce his property. His potatoes, pumpkins, and tortoises, with a pile of dollars he had hoarded from his mercantile operations, were secured on the spot. But while the two vindictive smugglers were busy destroying his hut and garden, Oberlus makes his escape into the mountains, and conceals himself there in impenetrable recesses only known to himself, till the ship sails, when he ventures back, and by means of an old file which he sticks into a tree, contrives to free himself from his handcuffs. Brooding among the ruins of his hut and the desolate clinkers and extinct volcanoes of this outcast isle, the insulted misanthrope now meditates a signal revenge upon humanity, but conceals his purposes. Vessels still touch the landing at times, and by Oberlus is enabled to supply them with some vegetables. Warned by his former failure in kidnapping strangers, he now pursues a quite different plan. When seamen come ashore, he makes up to them like a free and easy comrade, invites them to his hut, and with whatever affability his red-haired grimness may assume, entreats them to drink his liquor and be merry. But his guests need little pressing, and so, soon as rendered insensible, are tied hand and foot and pitched among the clinkers, are there concealed till the ship departs, when, finding themselves entirely dependent upon Oberlus, alarmed at his changed demeanor, his savage threats, and above all that shocking blunderbuss, they willingly enlist under him, becoming his humble slaves, and Oberlus the most incredible of tyrants, so much so that 2 or 3 perish beneath his initiating process. He sets the remainder, 4 of them, to breaking the caked soil, transporting upon their backs loads of loamy earth, scooped up in moist clefts among the mountains, keeps them on the roughest fare, presents his peace at the slightest hint of insurrection, and in all respects converts them into reptiles at his feet, plebeian garter snakes to his lord Anaconda. At last Oberlus contrives to stock his arsenal with 4 rusty cutlasses, and an added supply of powder and ball intended for his blunderbuss. Remitting in good part the labor of his slaves, he now approves himself a man, or rather devil, of great abilities in the way of cajoling or coercing others into acquiescence with his own ulterior designs, however at first abhorrent to them, but indeed prepared for almost any eventual evil by their previous lawless life, as a sort of ranging cowboys of the sea which had dissolved within them the whole moral man, so that they were ready to concrete in the first offered mold of baseness now, rotted down from manhood by their hopeless misery on the isle, wanted to cringe in all things to their lord, himself the worst of slaves. These wretches were now become wholly corrupted to his hands. He used them as creatures of an inferior race. In short, he gaffles his 4 animals, and makes murderers of them, out of cowards fitly manufacturing bravos. Now, sword or dagger, human arms are but artificial claws and fangs, tied on like false spurs to the fighting cock. So, we repeat, Oberlus, Czar of the isle, gaffles his 4 subjects, that is, with intent of glory, puts 4 rusty cutlasses into their hands. Like any other autocrat, he had a noble army now. It might be thought a servile war would hereupon ensue. Arms in the hands of trodden slaves? How indiscreet of Emperor Oberlus! Nay, they had but cutlasses, sad old scythes enough, he a blunderbuss, which, by its blind scatterings of all sorts of boulders, clinkers, and other scoria, would annihilate all 4 mutineers like 4 pigeons at one shot. Besides, at first he did not sleep in his accustomed hut. Every lurid sunset, for a time, he might have been seen wending his way among the riven mountains, there to secrete himself till dawn in some sulphurous pitfall undiscoverable to his gang, but finding this at last too troublesome, he now each evening tied his slaves hand and foot, hid the cutlasses, and thrusting them into his barracks, shut to the door, and lying down before it, beneath a rude shed lately added, slept out the night blunderbuss in hand. It is supposed that, not content with daily parading over a cindery solitude at the head of his fine army, Oberlus now meditated the most active mischief, his probable object being to surprise some passing ship touching at his dominions, massacre the crew, and run away with her to parts unknown. While these plans were simmering in his head, 2 ships touch in company at the isle, on the opposite side to his, when his designs undergo a sudden change. The ships are in want of vegetables, which Oberlus promises in great abundance, provided they send their boats round to his landing, so that the crews may bring the vegetables from his garden, informing the two captains at the same time that his rascals, slaves and soldiers, had become so abominably lazy and good for nothing of late that he could not make them work by ordinary inducements, and did not have the heart to be severe with them. The arrangement was agreed to, and the boats were sent and hauled upon the beach. The crews went to the lava hut, but to their surprise nobody was there. After waiting till their patience was exhausted, they returned to the shore, when lo, some stranger, not the Good Samaritan either, seems to have very recently passed that way. 3 of the boats were broken in 1,000 pieces, and the 4th was missing. By hard toil over the mountains and through the clinkers, some of the strangers succeeded in returning to that side of the isle where the ships lay, when fresh boats are sent to the relief of the rest of the hapless party. However amazed at the treachery of Oberlus, the 2 captains, afraid of new and still more mysterious atrocities, and indeed half imputing such strange events to the enchantments associated with these isles, perceive no security but in instant flight, leaving Oberlus and his army in quiet possession of the stolen boat. On the eve of sailing they put a letter in a keg giving the Pacific Ocean intelligence of the affair, and moored the keg in the bay. Some time subsequent the keg was opened by another captain chancing to anchor there, but not until after he had dispatched a boat round to Oberlus's landing. As may be readily surmised, he felt no little inquietude till the boat's return, when another letter was handed him, giving Oberlus's version of the affair. This precious document had been found pinned half mildewed to the clinker wall of the sulphurous and deserted hut. It ran as follows, showing that Oberlus was at least an accomplished writer, and no mere boor, and what is more, was capable of the most tristful eloquence. Sir, I am the most unfortunate, ill-treated gentleman that lives. I am a patriot, exiled from my country by the cruel hand of tyranny. Banished to these enchanted isles, I have again and again besought captains of ships to sell me a boat, but always have been refused, though I offered the handsomest prices in Mexican dollars. At length an opportunity presented of possessing myself of one, and I did not let it slip. I have been long endeavoring, by hard labor and much solitary suffering, to accumulate something to make myself comfortable in a virtuous though unhappy old age, but at various times have been robbed and beaten by men professing to be Christians. Today I sailed from the enchanted group in the good boat Charity, bound to the Fiji Isles. Fatherless Oberlus. P.S. Behind the clinkers nigh the oven you will find the old fowl. Do not kill it. Be patient. I leave it setting. If it shall have any chicks, I hereby bequeath them to you, whoever you may be. But don't count your chicks before they are hatched. The fowl proved a starveling rooster, reduced to a sitting posture by sheer debility. Oberlus declares that he was bound to the Fiji Isles, but this was only to throw pursuers on a false scent, for after a long time he arrived, alone in his open boat, at Guayaquil. As his miscreants were never again beheld on Hood's Isle, it is supposed either that they perished for want of water on the passage to Guayaquil, or, what is quite as probable, were thrown overboard by Oberlus when he found the water growing scarce. From Guayaquil Oberlus proceeded to Payta, and there, with that nameless witchery peculiar to some of the ugliest animals, wound himself into the affections of a tawny damsel, prevailing upon her to accompany him back to his enchanted isle, which doubtless he painted as a paradise of flowers, not as a Tartarus of clinkers. But unfortunately for the colonization of Hood's Isle, with a choice variety of animated nature, the extraordinary and devilish aspect of Oberlus made him to be regarded in Payta as a highly suspicious character, so that, being found concealed one night, with matches in his pocket, under the hull of a small vessel just ready to be launched, he was seized and thrown into jail. The jails in most South American towns are generally of the least wholesome sort, built of huge cakes of sunburnt brick, and containing but one room, without windows or yard, and but one door heavily grated with wooden bars. They present both within and without the grimmest aspect. As public edifices they conspicuously stand upon the hot and dusty plaza, offering to view, through the gratings, their villainous and hopeless inmates, burrowing in all sorts of tragic squalor. And here for a long time Oberlus was seen, the central figure of a mongrel and assassin band, a creature whom it is religion to detest, since it is philanthropy to hate a misanthrope. Note: They who may be disposed to question the possibility of the character above depicted are referred to the second volume of Porter's Voyage into the Pacific, where they will recognize many sentences, for expedition's sake derived verbatim from thence, and incorporated here. The main difference, save a few passing reflections, between the two accounts being that the present writer has added to Porter's facts accessory ones picked up in the Pacific from reliable sources, and, where facts conflict, has naturally preferred his own authorities to Porter's. As, for instance, his authorities place Oberlus on Hood's Isle, Porter's on Charles's Isle. The letter found in the hut is also somewhat different, for while at the Encantadas he was informed that not only did it evince a certain clerkliness, but was full of the strangest satiric effrontery which does not adequately appear in Porter's version, I accordingly altered it to suit the general character of its author. End of Section 17. The Encantadas, Sketch Ninth, Hood's Isle and the Hermit Oberlus. Section 18 of the Piazza Tales by Herman Melville. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 5J. The Encantadas, Sketch 10th. Runaways, Castaways, Solitaries, Gravestones, etc. And all about old stalks and stubs of trees, whereon nor fruit nor leaf was ever seen, did hang upon ragged knotty knees, on which had many wretches hanged been. Some relics of the hut of Oberlus partially remain to this day at the head of the clinkered valley, nor does the stranger, wandering among other of the enchanted isles, fail to stumble upon still other solitary abodes, long abandoned to the tortoise and the lizard. Probably few parts of earth have in modern times sheltered so many solitaries. The reason is that these isles are situated in a distant sea, and the vessels which occasionally visit them are mostly all whalers or ships bound on dreary and protracted voyages, exempting them in a good degree from both the oversight and the memory of human law. Such is the character of some commanders and some seamen that under these untoward circumstances it is quite impossible but that scenes of unpleasantness and discord should occur between them. A sullen hatred of the tyrannic ship will seize the sailor, and he gladly exchanges it for isles, which, though blighted as by a continual sirocco and burning breeze, still offer him, in their labyrinthine interior, a retreat beyond the possibility of capture. To flee the ship in any Peruvian or Chilean port, even the smallest and most rustical, is not unattended with great risk of apprehension, not to speak of jaguars. A reward of 5 pesos sends 50 dastardly Spaniards into the wood, who, with long knives, scour them day and night in eager hopes of securing their prey. Neither is it in general much easier to escape pursuit at the isles of Polynesia. Those of them which have felt a civilizing influence present the same difficulty to the runaway with the Peruvian ports, the advanced natives being quite as mercenary and keen of knife and scent as the retrograde Spaniards, while, owing to the bad odor in which all Europeans lie, in the minds of aboriginal savages who have chanced to hear aught of them, to desert the ship among primitive Polynesians is, in most cases, a hope not unforlorn. Hence the Enchanted Isles become the voluntary tarrying places of all sorts of refugees, some of whom too sadly experience the fact that flight from tyranny does not of itself insure a safe asylum, far less a happy home. Moreover, it has not seldom happened that hermits have been made upon the isles by the accidents incident to tortoise hunting. The interior of most of them is tangled and difficult of passage beyond description. The air is sultry and stifling. An intolerable thirst is provoked, for which no running stream offers its kind relief. In a few hours, under an equatorial sun, reduced by these causes to entire exhaustion, woe betide the straggler at the Enchanted Isles. Their extent is such as to forbid an adequate search unless weeks are devoted to it. The impatient ship waits a day or two, when, the missing man remaining undiscovered, up goes a stake on the beach with a letter of regret and a keg of crackers and another of water tied to it, and away sails the craft. Nor have there been wanting instances where the inhumanity of some captains has led them to wreak a secure revenge upon seamen who have given their caprice or pride some singular offense. Thrust ashore upon the scorching marl, such mariners are abandoned to perish outright, unless by solitary labors they succeed in discovering some precious driblets of moisture oozing from a rock or stagnant in a mountain pool. I was well acquainted with a man who, lost upon the Isle of Narborough, was brought to such extremes by thirst that at last he only saved his life by taking that of another being. A large hair seal came upon the beach. He rushed upon it, stabbed it in the neck, and then throwing himself upon the panting body, quaffed at the living wound. The palpitations of the creature's dying heart injected life into the drinker. Another seaman thrust ashore in a boat upon an isle at which no ship ever touched, owing to its peculiar sterility and the shoals about it, and from which all other parts of the group were hidden. This man, feeling that it was sure death to remain there, and that nothing worse than death menaced him in quitting it, killed seals, and inflating their skins, made a float upon which he transported himself to Charles Island, and joined the Republic there. But men not endowed with courage equal to such desperate attempts find their only resource in forthwith seeking some watering place, however precarious or scanty, building a hut, catching tortoises and birds, and in all respects preparing for a hermit life, till tide or time or a passing ship arrives to float them off. At the foot of precipices on many of the isles, small rude basins in the rocks are found, partly filled with rotted rubbish or vegetable decay, or overgrown with thickets, and sometimes a little moist, which upon examination reveal plain tokens of artificial instruments employed in hollowing them out by some poor castaway or still more miserable runaway. These basins are made in places where it was supposed some scanty drops of dew might exude into them from the upper crevices. The relics of hermitages and stone basins are not the only signs of vanishing humanity to be found upon the isles, and, curious to say, that spot which of all others in settled communities is most animated, at the Enchanted Isles presents the most dreary of aspects. And though it may seem very strange to talk of post offices in this barren region, yet post offices are occasionally to be found there. They consist of a stake and a bottle, the letters being not only sealed but corked. They are generally deposited by captains of Nantucketers for the benefit of passing fishermen, and contain statements as to what luck they had in whaling or tortoise hunting. Frequently, however, long months and months, whole years glide by, and no applicant appears. The stake rots and falls, presenting no very exhilarating object. If now it be added that gravestones, or rather grave boards, are also discovered upon some of the isles, the picture will be complete. Upon the beach of James Isle for many years was to be seen a rude finger post pointing inland, and perhaps, taking it for some signal of possible hospitality in this otherwise desolate spot, some good hermit living there with his maple dish, the stranger would follow on in the path thus indicated, till at last he would come out in a noiseless nook and find his only welcome, a dead man, his sole greeting in the inscription over a grave: "Here in 1813 fell, in a daybreak duel, a lieutenant of the U.S. frigate Essex, aged 21, attaining his majority in death." It is but fit that, like those old monastic institutions of Europe, whose inmates go not out of their own walls to be immured, but are entombed there where they die, the Encantadas, too, should bury their own dead, even as the great general monastery of earth does hers. It is known that burial in the ocean is a pure necessity of seafaring life, and that it is only done when land is far astern, and not clearly visible from the bow. Hence to vessels cruising in the vicinity of the Enchanted Isles they afford a convenient potter's field. The interment over, some good-natured forecastle poet and artist seizes his paint-brush and inscribes a doggerel epitaph. When after a long lapse of time other good-natured seamen chance to come upon the spot, they usually make a table of the mound, and quaff a friendly can to the poor soul's repose. As a specimen of these epitaphs, take the following, found in a bleak gorge of Chatham Isle: "O brother Jack, as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I, just so game and just so gay, but now, alack, they've stopped my pay. No more I peep out of my blinkers, here I be, tucked in with clinkers." End of Section 18. The Encantada, Sketch 10th. Runaways, Castaways, Solitaries, Gravestones, etc. Section 19 of The Piazza Tales by Herman Melville. This recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 6. The Bell Tower. In the south of Europe, nigh a once frescoed capital, now with dank mold cankering its bloom, central in a plain, stands what, at distance, seems the black-mossed stump of some immeasurable pine, fallen, in forgotten days, with Anak and the Titan. As all along where the pine tree falls, its dissolution leaves a mossy mound, last flung shadow of the perished trunk, never lengthening, never lessening, unsubject to the fleet falsities of the sun, shade immutable, and true gauge which cometh by prostration, so westward from what seems the stump, one steadfast spear of lichened ruin veins the plain. From that tree-top what birded chimes of silver throats had sung! A stone pine, a metallic aviary in its crown, the bell tower, built by the great mechanician, the unblessed foundling, Bonadonna. Like Babel's, its base was laid in a high hour of renovated earth, following the second deluge, when the waters of the Dark Ages had dried up, and once more the green appeared. No wonder that after so long and deep submersion the jubilant expectation of the race should, as with Noah's sons, soar into shiner aspiration. In firm resolve, no man in Europe at that period went beyond Bonadonna. Enriched through commerce with the Levant, the state in which he lived voted to have the noblest bell tower in Italy. His repute assigned him to be architect. Stone by stone, month by month, the tower rose, higher, higher, snail like in pace, but torch or rocket in its pride. After the masons would depart, the builder, standing alone upon its ever ascending summit, at close of every day, saw that he overtopped still higher walls and trees. He would tarry till a late hour there, wrapped in schemes of other and still loftier piles. Those who of saints' days thronged the spot, hanging to the rude poles of scaffolding, like sailors on yards or bees on boughs, unmindful of lime and dust, and falling chips of stone, their homage not the less inspired him to self-esteem. At length the holiday of the Tower came. To the sound of viols the climax stone slowly rose in air, and, amid the firing of ordnance, was laid by Bannadonna's hands upon the final course. Then, mounting it, he stood erect, alone, with folded arms, gazing upon the white summits of blue inland Alps, and whiter crests of bluer Alps offshore, sights invisible from the plain. Invisible, too, from thence was that eye he turned below, when, like the cannon booms, came up to him the people's combustions of applause. That which stirred them so was seeing with what serenity the builder stood 300 feet in the air upon an unrailed perch. This none but he durst do, but his periodic standing upon the pile in each stage of its growth, such discipline had its last result. Little remained now but the bells. These, in all respects, must correspond with their receptacle. The minor ones were prosperously cast. A highly enriched one followed, of singular make, intended for suspension in a manner before unknown. The purpose of this bell, its rotary motion and connection with the clockwork, also executed at the time, will, in the sequel, receive mention. In the one erection, bell tower and clock tower were united, though before that period such structures had commonly been built distinct, as the Campanile and Torre de Orologio of St. Mark to this day attest. But it was upon the great state bell that the founder lavished his more daring skill. In vain did some of the less elated magistrates here caution him, saying that though truly the tower was titanic, yet limit should be set to the dependent weight of its swaying masses. But undeterred, he prepared his mammoth mold, dented with mythological devices, kindled his fires of balsamic firs, melted his tin and copper, and, throwing in much plate, contributed by the public spirit of the nobles, let loose the tide. The unleashed metals bayed like hounds. The workmen shrunk. Through their fright, fatal harm to the bell was dreaded. Fearless as Shadrach, Bennadonna, rushing through the glow, smote the chief culprit with his ponderous ladle. From the smitten part a splinter was dashed into the seething mass, and at once was melted in. Next day a portion of the work was heedfully uncovered. All seemed right. Upon the third morning, with equal satisfaction, it was bared still lower. At length, like some old Theban king, the whole cooled casting was disinterred. All was fair, except in one strange spot. But as he suffered no one to attend him in these inspections, he concealed the blemish by some preparation which none knew better to devise. The casting of such a mass was deemed no small triumph for the caster, one, too, in which the state might not scorn to share. The homicide was overlooked. By the charitable, that deed was but imputed to sudden transports of aesthetic passion, not to any flagitious quality. A kick from an Arabian charger, not sign of vice, but blood. His felony remitted by the judge, absolution given him by the priest, what more could even a sickly conscience have desired? Honoring the tower and its builder with another holiday, the Republic witnessed the hoisting of the bells and clockwork amid shows and pomps superior to the former. Some months of more than usual solitude on Bernardona's part ensued. It was not unknown that he was engaged upon something for the belfry, intended to complete it and surpass all that had gone before. Most people imagined that the design would involve a casting like the bells, but those who thought they had some further insight would shake their heads with hints that not for nothing did the mechanician keep so secret. Meantime, his seclusion failed not to invest his work with more or less of that sort of mystery pertaining to the forbidden. Ere long he had a heavy object hoisted to the belfry, wrapped in a dark sack or cloak, a procedure sometimes had in the case of an elaborate piece of sculpture or statue, which, being intended to grace the front of a new edifice, the architect does not desire exposed to critical eyes till set up, finished, in its appointed place. Such was the impression now, but as the object rose, a statuary present observed, or thought he did, that it was not entirely rigid, but was, in a manner, pliant. At last, when the hidden thing had attained its final height, and, obscurely seen from below, seemed almost of itself to step into the belfry, as if with little assistance from the crane, a shrewd old blacksmith present ventured the suspicion that it was but a living man. This surmise was thought a foolish one, while the general interest failed not to augment. Not without demur from Bernardona, the chief magistrate of the town, with an associate, both elderly men, followed what seemed the image up the tower, but arrived at the belfry they had little recompense. Plausibly entrenching himself behind the conceded mysteries of his art, the mechanician withheld present explanation. The magistrates glanced toward the cloaked object, which, to their surprise, seemed now to have changed its attitude, or else had before been more perplexingly concealed by the violent muffling action of the wind without. It seemed now seated upon some sort of frame or chair contained within the domino. They observed that nigh the top, in a sort of square, the web of the cloth, either from accident or design, had its warp partly withdrawn, and the cross threads plucked out here and there, so as to form a sort of woven grating. Whether it were the low wind or no, stealing through the stone lattice work, or only their own perturbed imaginations, is uncertain, but they thought they discerned a slight sort of fitful spring-like motion in the domino. Nothing, however incidental or insignificant, escaped their uneasy eyes. Among other things they pried out, in a corner, an earthen cup, partly corroded and partly encrusted, and one whispered to the other that this cup was just such a one as might in mockery be offered to the lips of some brazen statue, or perhaps still worse. But being questioned, the mechanician said that the cup was simply used in his founder's business, and described the purpose. In short, a cup to test the condition of metals in fusion. He added that it had got into the belfry by the merest chance. Again and again they gazed at the domino, as at some suspicious incognito at a Venetian mask. All sorts of vague apprehensions stirred them. They even dreaded lest, when they should descend, the mechanician, though without a flesh and blood companion for all that, would not be left alone. Affecting some merriment at their disquietude, he begged to relieve them by extending a coarse sheet of workman's canvas between them and the object. Meantime he sought to interest them in his other work. Nor, now that the domino was out of sight, did they long remain insensible to the artistic wonders lying round them, wonders hitherto beheld but in their unfinished state, because since hoisting the bells none but the caster had entered within the belfry. It was one trait of his that even in details he would not let another do what he could, without too great loss of time, accomplish for himself. So for several preceding weeks whatever hours were unemployed in his secret design had been devoted to elaborating the figures on the bells. The clock bell in particular now drew attention. Under a patient chisel the latent beauty of its enrichments before obscured by the cloudings incident to casting, that beauty in its shyest grace, was now revealed. Round and round the bell 12 figures of gay girls, garlanded, hand in hand, danced in a choral ring, the embodied hours. "Bonadonna," said the chief, "this bell excels all else. No added touch could here improve. Hark!" hearing a sound, "was that the wind?" "The wind, Excellenza," was the light response. "But the figures they are not yet without their faults. They need some touches yet. When those are given, and the block yonder," pointing towards the canvas screen, "when Haman there, as I merrily call him, it, I mean, when Haman is fixed on this, his lofty tree, then, gentlemen, will I be most happy to receive you here again." The equivocal reference to the object caused some return of restlessness. However, on their part the visitors forbore further allusion to it, unwilling, perhaps, to let the foundling see how easily it lay within his plebeian art to stir the placid dignity of nobles. "Well, Bonadonna," said the chief, "how long ere you are ready to set the clock going, so that the hour shall be sounded? Our interest in you, not less than in the work itself, makes us anxious to be assured of your success. The people, too, why, they are shouting now. Say the exact hour when you will be ready." "Tomorrow, Excellenza. If you listen for it, or should you not, all the same, strange music will be heard. The stroke of one shall be the first from yonder bell," pointing to the bell adorned with girls and garlands. "That stroke shall fall there where the hand of Una clasps Dua's. The stroke of one shall sever that loved clasp. Tomorrow, then, at 1 o'clock, as struck here, precisely here," advancing and placing his finger upon the clasp, "the poor mechanic will be most happy once more to give you liege audience in this his littered shop. Farewell till then, illustrious magnificos, and hark ye for your vassal's stroke." His still, volcanic face hiding its burning brightness like a forge, he moved with ostentatious deference towards the scuttle, as if so far to escort their exit. But the junior magistrate, a kind hearted man, troubled at what seemed to him a certain sardonical disdain lurking beneath the foundling's humble mien, and in Christian sympathy more distressed at it on his account than on his own, dimly surmising what might be the final fate of such a cynic solitaire, nor perhaps uninfluenced by the general strangeness of surrounding things, this good magistrate had glanced sadly sideways from the speaker, and there upon his foreboding eye had started at the expression of the unchanging face of the hour Una. "How is this, Bonadonna?" he lowly asked. "Una looks unlike her sisters." "In Christ's name, Bonadonna," impulsively broke in the chief, his attention for the first attracted to the figure by his associate's remark, "Una's face looks just like that of Deborah, the prophetess, as painted by Florentine del Fonca." "Surely, Bonadonna," lowly resumed the milder magistrate, "you meant the 12 should wear the same jocundly abandoned air. But see, the smile of Una seems but a fatal one. 'Tis different." While his mild associate was speaking, the chief glanced inquiringly from him to the caster, as if anxious to mark how the discrepancy would be accounted for. As the chief stood, his advanced foot was on the scuttle's curb. Bonadonna spoke. "Excellenza, now that, following your keener eye, I glance upon the face of Una, I do indeed perceive some little variance. But look all round the bell, and you will find no two faces entirely correspond, because there is a law in art. But the cold wind is rising more. These lattices are but a poor defense. Suffer me, magnificos, to conduct you, at least, partly on your way. Those in whose well-being there is a public stake should be heedfully attended." "Touching the look of Una, you were saying, Bonadonna, "That there was a certain law in art," observed the chief, as the three now descended the stone shaft. "Pray tell me, then. Pardon, another time, Excellenza. The tower is damp." "Nay, I must rest, and hear it now. Here, here is a wide landing, and through this leeward slit no wind, but ample light. Tell us of your law, and at large." "Since, Excellenza, you insist, know that there is a law in art which bars the possibility of duplicates. Some years ago, you may remember, I graved a small seal for your republic, bearing for its chief device the head of your own ancestor, its illustrious founder. It becoming necessary for the custom's use to have innumerable impressions for bales and boxes, I graved an entire plate containing 100 of the seals. Now, though, indeed, my object was to have those 100 heads identical, and though I dare say people think them, so yet upon closely scanning an uncut impression from the plate, no two of those 50 faces, side by side, will be found alike. Gravity is the air of all, but diversified in all. In some benevolent, in some ambiguous, in two or three, to a close scrutiny, all but incipiently malign, the variation of less than a hair's breadth in the linear shadings round the mouth sufficing to all this. Now, Excellenza, transmute that general gravity into joyousness, and subject it to 12 of those variations I have described, and tell me, will you not have my hours here, and Una one of them? But I like Hark! Is that a footfall above?" "Mortar, Excellenza. Sometimes it drops to the belfry floor from the arch where the stonework was left undressed. I must have it seen to. As I was about to say, for one, I like this law forbidding duplicates. It evokes fine personalities. Yes, Excellenza, that strange and, to you, uncertain smile, and those forelooking eyes of Una, suit Bernardona very well." "Hark! Sure we left no soul above?" "No soul, Excellenza. Rest assured, no soul. Again the mortar." "It fell not while we were there." "Ah, in your presence it better knew its place, Excellenza," blandly bowed Bernardona. "But Una," said the milder magistrate, "she seemed intently gazing on you. One would have almost sworn that she picked you out from among us three." "If she did, possibly it might have been her finer apprehension, Excellenza." "How, Bernardona? I do not understand you." "No consequence, no consequence, Excellenza, but the shifted wind is blowing through the slit. Suffer me to escort you on, and then pardon, but the toiler must to his tools." "It may be foolish, senor," said the milder magistrate, as from the third landing the two now went down unescorted, "but somehow our great mechanician moves me strangely. Why, just now, when he so superciliously replied, his walk seemed Sisera's, God's vain foe, in Delfonca's painting. And that young sculptured Deborah, too. Ay, and that
"Tush, tush, senor," returned the chief. "A passing whim. Deborah? Where's Jael, pray?"
"Ah," said the other, as they now stepped upon the sod. "Ah, senor, I see you leave your fears behind you with the chill and gloom, but mine, even in this sunny air, remain. Hark!" It was a sound from just within the tower door, whence they had emerged. Turning, they saw it closed.
"He has slipped down and barred us out," smiled the chief, "but it is his custom."
Proclamation was now made that the next day, at 1 hour after meridian, the clock would strike, and, thanks to the mechanician's powerful art, with unusual accompaniments. But what those should be none as yet could say. The announcement was received with cheers. By the looser sort, who encamped about the tower all night, lights were seen gleaming through the topmost blindwork, only disappearing with the morning sun. Strange sounds, too, were heard, or were thought to be by those whom anxious watching might not have left mentally undisturbed, sounds not only of some ringing implement, but also, so they said, half suppressed screams and plainings, such as might have issued from some ghostly engine overplied. Slowly the day drew on, part of the concourse chasing the weary time with songs and games, till at last the great blurred sun rolled like a football against the plain. At noon the nobility and principal citizens came from the town in cavalcade, a guard of soldiers also, with music, the more to honor the occasion. Only 1 hour more. Impatience grew. Watches were held in hands of feverish men, who stood now scrutinizing their small dial plates, and then, with neck thrown back, gazing toward the belfry, as if the eye might foretell that which could only be made sensible to the ear, for as yet there was no dial to the tower clock. The hour hands of 1,000 watches now verged within a hair's breadth of the figure 1. A silence, as of the expectation of some Shiloh, pervaded the swarming plain. Suddenly a dull, mangled sound, naught ringing in it, scarcely audible, indeed, to the outer circle of the people, that dull sound dropped heavily from the belfry. At the same moment each man stared at his neighbor blankly. All watches were upheld, all hour hands had passed the figure 1. No bell stroke from the tower. The multitude became tumultuous. Waiting a few moments, the chief magistrate, commanding silence, hailed the belfry to know what thing unforeseen had happened there. No response. He hailed again, and yet again. All continued hushed. By his order the soldiers burst in the tower door. When stationing guards to defend it from the now surging mob, the chief, accompanied by his former associate, climbed the winding stairs. Halfway up they stopped to listen. No sound. Mounting faster, they reached the belfry, but at the threshold started at the spectacle disclosed. A spaniel, which, unbeknown to them, had followed them thus far, stood shivering as before some unknown monster in a brake, or rather as if it snuffed footsteps leading to some other world. Bannadonna lay, prostrate and bleeding, at the base of the bell, which was adorned with girls and garlands. He lay at the feet of the hour Una, his head coinciding in a vertical line with her left hand clasped by the hour Dua. With downcast face impending over him, like Jael over nailed Sisera in the tent, was the domino, now no more becloaked. It had limbs, and seemed clad in a scaly mail lustrous as a dragon beetle's. It was manacled, and its clubbed arms were uplifted, as if with its manacles once more to smite its already smitten victim. One advanced foot of it was inserted beneath the dead body, as if in the act of spurning it. Uncertainty falls on what now followed. It were but natural to suppose that the magistrates would at first shrink from immediate personal contact with what they saw. At the least, for a time, they would stand in involuntary doubt, it may be in more or less of horrified alarm. Certain it is that an arquebus was called for from below, and some add that its report, followed by a fierce whiz, as of the sudden snapping of a mainspring, with a steely din, as if a stack of sword blades should be dashed upon a pavement, these blended sounds came ringing to the plain, attracting every eye far upward to the belfry, whence, through the lattice work, thin wreaths of smoke were curling. Some averred that it was the spaniel, gone mad by fear, which was shot. This others denied. True it was, the spaniel never more was seen, and probably for some unknown reason it shared the burial now to be related of the domino. For whatever the preceding circumstances may have been, the first instinctive panic over, or else all ground of reasonable fear removed, the two magistrates by themselves quickly rehooded the figure in the dropped cloak wherein it had been hoisted. The same night it was secretly lowered to the ground, smuggled to the beach, pulled far out to sea, and sunk. Nor to any after urgency, even in free convivial hours, would the twain ever disclose the full secrets of the belfry. From the mystery unavoidably investing it, the popular solution of the foundling's fate involved more or less of supernatural agency, but some few less unscientific minds pretended to find little difficulty in otherwise accounting for it. In the chain of circumstantial inferences drawn there may, or may not, have been some absent or defective links. But as the explanation in question is the only one which tradition has explicitly preserved, in dearth of better, it will here be given. But, in the first place, it is requisite to present the supposition entertained as to the entire motive and mode, with their origin, of the secret design of Bannadonna, the minds above mentioned assuming to penetrate as well into his soul as into the event. The disclosure will indirectly involve reference to peculiar matters, none of the clearest beyond the immediate subject. At that period no large bell was made to sound otherwise than as at present, by agitation of a tongue within by means of ropes, or percussion from without, either from cumbrous machinery or stalwart watchmen armed with heavy hammers, stationed in the belfry or in sentry boxes on the open roof, according as the bell was sheltered or exposed. It was from observing these exposed bells with their watchmen that the foundling, as was opined, derived the first suggestion of his scheme. Perched on a great mast or spire, the human figure, viewed from below, undergoes such a reduction in its apparent size as to obliterate its intelligent features. It evinces no personality. Instead of bespeaking volition, its gestures rather resemble the automatic ones of the arms of a telegraph. Musing, therefore, upon the purely Punchinello aspect of the human figure thus beheld, it had indirectly occurred to Bannadonna to devise some metallic agent which should strike the hour with its mechanic hand with even greater precision than the vital one, and, moreover, as the vital watchman on the roof, sallying from his retreat at the given periods, walked to the bell with uplifted mace to smite it, Bannadonna had resolved that his invention should likewise possess the power of locomotion and, along with that, the appearance, at least, of intelligence and will. If the conjectures of those who claimed acquaintance with the intent of Bannadonna be thus far correct, no unenterprising spirit could have been his. But they stopped not here, intimating that though indeed his design had, in the first place, been prompted by the sight of the watchman, and confined to the devising of a subtle substitute for him, yet, as is not seldom the case with projectors, by insensible gradations, proceeding from comparatively pigmy aims to titanic ones, the original scheme had, in its anticipated eventualities, at last attained to an unheard of degree of daring. He still bent his efforts upon the locomotive figure for the belfry, but only as a partial type of an ulterior creature, a sort of elephantine helot, adapted to further, in a degree scarcely to be imagined, the universal conveniences and glories of humanity, supplying nothing less than a supplement to the 6 days' work, stocking the earth with a new serf, more useful than the ox, swifter than the dolphin, stronger than the lion, more cunning than the ape, for industry an ant, more fiery than serpents, and yet, in patience, another ass. All excellences of all God-made creatures which served man were here to receive advancement, and then to be combined in one. Talus was to have been the all-accomplished helot's name, Talus, iron slave to Bannadonna, and through him to man. Here it might well be thought that, were these last conjectures as to the foundling's secrets not erroneous, then must he have been hopelessly infected with the craziest chimeras of his age, far outgoing Albert Magus and Cornelius Agrippa. But the contrary was averred. However marvelous his design, however apparently transcending not alone the bounds of human invention, but those of divine creation, yet the proposed means to be employed were alleged to have been confined within the sober forms of sober reason. It was affirmed that, to a degree of more than skeptic scorn, Bonnadonna had been without sympathy for any of the vainglorious irrationalities of his time. For example, he had not concluded with the visionaries among the metaphysicians that between the finer mechanic forces and the ruder animal vitality some germ of correspondence might prove discoverable. As little did his scheme partake of the enthusiasm of some natural philosophers who hoped, by physiological and chemical inductions, to arrive at a knowledge of the source of life, and so qualify themselves to manufacture and improve upon it. Much less had he aught in common with the tribe of alchemists, who sought by a species of incantations to evoke some surprising vitality from the laboratory. Neither had he imagined, with certain sanguine theosophists, that by faithful adoration of the highest, unheard of powers would be vouchsafed to man. A practical materialist, what Bonnadonna had aimed at was to have been reached not by logic, not by crucible, not by conjuration, not by altars, but by plain vice bench and hammer. In short, to solve nature, to steal into her, to intrigue upon her, to procure some one else to bind her to his hand these, one and all, had not been his objects. But asking no favors from any element or any being of himself to rival her, outstrip her, and rule her. He stooped to conquer. With him common sense was theurgy, machinery miracle, Prometheus the heroic name for machinist, man the true god. Nevertheless, in his initial step, so far as the experimental automaton for the belfry was concerned, he allowed fancy some little play. Or perhaps what seemed his fancifulness was but his utilitarian ambition collaterally extended. In figure, the creature for the belfry should not be likened after the human pattern, nor any animal one, or after the ideals, however wild, of ancient fable, but equally in aspect as in organism be an original production, the more terrible to behold the better. Such, then, were the suppositions as to the present scheme and the reserved intent. How, at the very threshold, so unlooked for a catastrophe overturned all, or rather, what was the conjecture here, is now to be set forth. It was thought that on the day preceding the fatality, his visitors having left him, Bonnadonna had unpacked the belfry image, adjusted it, and placed it in the retreat provided, a sort of sentry box in one corner of the belfry. In short, throughout the night, and for some part of the ensuing morning, he had been engaged in arranging everything connected with the domino, the issuing from the sentry box each 60 minutes, sliding along a grooved way like a railway, advancing to the clock bell with uplifted manacles, striking it at one of the 12 junctions of the 24 hands, then wheeling, circling the bell, and retiring to its post, there to bide for another 60 minutes, when the same process was to be repeated. The bell, by a cunning mechanism, meantime turning on its vertical axis so as to present to the descending mace the clasped hands of the next 2 figures, when it would strike 2, 3, and so on to the end. The musical metal in this time bell being so managed in the fusion, by some art perishing with its originator, that each of the clasps of the 24 hands should give forth its own peculiar resonance when parted. But on the magic metal the magic and metallic stranger never struck but that one stroke, drove but that one nail, served but that one clasp, by which Bonnadonna clung to his ambitious life. For after winding up the creature in the sentry box so that, for the present, skipping the intervening hours, it should not emerge till the hour of one, but should then infallibly emerge, and after deftly oiling the grooves whereon it was to slide, it was surmised that the mechanician must then have hurried to the bell to give his final touches to its sculpture. True artist, he here became absorbed, and absorption still further intensified, it may be, by his striving to abate that strange look of Una, which, though before others he had treated with such unconcern, might not, in secret, have been without its thorn. And so, for the interval, he was oblivious of his creature, which, not oblivious of him, and true to its creation, and true to its heedful winding up, left its post precisely at the given moment, along its well oiled route, slid noiselessly towards its mark, and, aiming at the hand of Una, to ring one clangorous note, dully smote the intervening brain of Bannadonna, turned backwards to it. The manacled arms then instantly upspringing to their hovering poise. The falling body clogged the thing's return, so there it stood, still impending over Bannadonna, as if whispering some post mortem terror. The chisel lay dropped from the hand, but beside the hand the oil flask spilled across the iron track. In his unhappy end, not unmindful of the rare genius of the mechanician, the Republic decreed him a stately funeral. It was resolved that the great bell, the one whose casting had been jeopardized through the timidity of the ill-starred workman, should be rung upon the entrance of the bier into the cathedral. The most robust man of the country round was assigned the office of bell-ringer. As the pall-bearers entered the cathedral porch, naught but a broken and disastrous sound, like that of some lone Alpine landslide, fell from the tower upon their ears, and then all was hushed. Glancing backwards, they saw the groined belfry crashed sideways in. It afterwards appeared that the powerful peasant, who had the bell rope in charge, wishing to test at once the full glory of the bell, had swayed down upon the rope with one concentrated jerk. The mass of quaking metal, too ponderous for its frame, and strangely feeble somewhere at its top, loosed from its fastening, tore sideways down, and tumbling in one sheer fall 300 feet to the soft sward below, buried itself inverted and half out of sight. Upon its disinterment the main fracture was found to have started from a small spot in the ear, which, being scraped, revealed a defect, deceptively minute in the castings, which defect must subsequently have been pasted over with some unknown compound. The remolten metal soon reassumed its place in the tower's repaired superstructure. For 1 year the metallic choir of birds sang musically in its belfry bow-work of sculptured blinds and traceries. But on the first anniversary of the tower's completion, at early dawn, before the concourse had surrounded it, an earthquake came. One loud crash was heard. The stone pine, with all its bower of songsters, lay overthrown upon the plain. So the blind slave obeyed its blinder lord, but in obedience slew him. So the Creator was killed by the creature. So the bell was too heavy for the tower. So the bell's main weakness was where man's blood had flawed it. And so pride went before the fall. End of Chapter 6, The Bell Tower, and end of the Piazza Tales by Herman Melville.